Welcome everybody to the Impact Policy Podcast. My name is Sam Johnson. If this is your first time hearing this podcast series, Impact Policy is a social policy consulting firm. We work closely with the public sector around what we call the big pieces of the policy puzzle: co-design, engagement, communications, research and evaluation, and everything in between. Today you're going to hear from another member of our Impact Policy team, an expert in his field, and someone you'll get to understand a little bit more about in detail as well. But before I go any further, I want to take a moment to acknowledge country. We're recording here today on Bidjigal country. I want to pay my deepest respects to our elders past and present. I want to also recognise that wherever you're consuming this content from today, you're on Aboriginal land, always was, always will be, and never ceded by treaty. Before we go any further, a little bit more about today's guest, Kyan Mitchell. He joins Impact Policy as a senior consultant. He comes from an extensive background in the youth justice sector. He's a proud Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal and Bundjalung man, and we are so grateful and pleased to have him as part of the Impact Policy crew. So today we'll take a bit of a deep dive into some of his background, some of his journey, what's led him to where he is today, and I guess maybe some of his key learnings and reflections across that journey as well. So a bit of a relaxing, fun yarn, but I'm sure something that many people will take away from both professionally and personally as well. So with that, I might hand it over to Kyan to tell us a little bit about yourself, brother, who you are, where you're from, what you do, and all that stuff as well.
Thanks, Brett. Yeah, Kyan. I grew up in Cowra. I was born and raised there, you know. My parents were from there. My mum's family have been there for as long as I can go back, so I was from Cowra. Moved to Sydney as a teenager and been in Sydney, bounced around different places in Sydney, so my life's been based here as an adult, really. Like you said, proud Wiradjuri, Ngunnawal, Bundjalung man, but the Bundjalung side being on my father's side. I spent the last plus 6 years in the youth justice sector, worked both operationally as a caseworker in the community space here in Sydney, as a Aboriginal practice officer in the custodial space for a year, and then I've been in the Aboriginal strategic space for the last 18 months or 2 years. So a bit of a different background, and it's really been, most of my professional experience has been in the public sector, so I'm really excited to jump over and join Impact.
Yeah, unreal. How did you find yourself in the justice space?
Yeah, it's funny, Brad, because I never planned it. It wasn't something that I wanted to do. Marcel Jordan, she was the area manager at Sydney office, and she was linked up with Uncle Dean Kelly and Eric Brown, and they were doing sort of cultural stuff.
Yep.
Pretty forward thinking for the government sector, and it was really the first time I'd been introduced to co-design. We had Uncle Dean, who was an external Aboriginal person, building a cultural program, and they'd been running that for a bit, and they're looking for someone to come in as a caseworker, but to sort of have those sort of skills to support Uncle Dean and Eric, and I had no experience really in that space. It wasn't something I was looking for. Government was not something I'd ever thought about, and I just got a phone call, and we started with a 3-month contract.
Yep.
See how both parties. I was just 22, I think, super young and inexperienced, and sort of did that first 12 months on short contracts, and it was a very steep learning curve, but I was lucky to go into a really good space like that and learn.
Yeah, wow. I love that. I love how that really sort of highlights as well non-traditional career pathways, particularly in these sort of justice sector. You know, I think about the impact that I've seen you have already in your career, and how the opportunity for that really sort of came about non-traditionally, right?
It came from Marcel, who's the manager, who's white, going to the community and asking people.
Yeah.
Because I never would have won that job in a normal government government way. In fact, I never would have known about the job. There's a lesson there for the public sector.
Yeah,
that there's
massively.
Aboriginal people out there that probably aren't going to have the experience and skills that you might value traditionally, but there's opportunities to tap into community. But that means that you have to have those relationships in community first.
Yeah. I think that is such a powerful lesson. Like, we hear that time and time again about the public sector particularly, but you know, many industries looking at how to recruit and retain Aboriginal staff, and it's consistently been such a problem for so long, or such a challenge for so long for many organisations to navigate. And I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head, right, in terms of it coming back to, I mean, you talk about Marcel there in terms of really championing relationships with community and community identifying people that they believe, would really add value based on what they know.
Yeah, and then, because of she'd already been down that path, you've got Eric Brown and Uncle Dean who are in that space with me as older Aboriginal men. And it was a really tough 12 months, actually, learning-wise. It was a steep learning curve, but having all those different components and being supported, that's the only way I stayed in the public sector.
Yeah, true. Yeah, unreal. And so that was your entry into the space. You found yourself on the front line. What were some of those major sort of learnings off the back of that sort of start of that journey?
The government systems take a lot of work to learn. They're pretty complex, probably over complex, so there's a lot of that practical stuff that you have to learn, and taking notes and writing reports. Something that I did pretty early on was I got to learn the courts systems, and then Koori Court came to Surrey Hills, and I sort of took agency of that from the youth justice perspective, and it was a really good experience. I did that for about 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
And it's, but there's a lot to learn, but you sort of need to really commit to learning these things on a deeper level so that you can advocate in a way that's meaningful.
Yeah, definitely.
And I think, you're right. I think on the other side of that, I really learnt that things that government prioritise are one thing, but we sort of know what our people need. So when you can learn and understand the system, you can push what is important to you forward, which for me was really like culture and things like that.
Yeah. And so you talk about spending 4 to 5 years around the Koori Courts. Can you describe for someone listening that maybe they're working in the sector, new to the sector, or be interested in this sort of space? What does a Koori Court mean? What does it look like? And I guess maybe what are some of your reflections on that sort of connection to that space?
Yeah, look, it's a good program. I mean, like any program, it's developed and improved over time. It's celebrated 10 years this year. It's a diversionary court program for young Aboriginal people in the justice system. So what it is, if a Aboriginal young person gets found guilty or pleads guilty to an offence, if they're eligible, they can move into youth Koori Court. So instead of getting sentenced, you can spend X amount of time on bail. You get an action and support plan, you get wraparound support, and they get an opportunity to show the court that, with this support, they don't need to be in custody, in short. I guess the trade-off is that you stay on bail for longer.
Yeah.
But, it's a good opportunity. And I know at one point at Sydney office, we had 0 Aboriginal young people in custody.
Yeah, okay.
And without Koori Court and Uncle Dean's cultural program, both those things, it wouldn't have been possible.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a really good program.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're doing a bit of work that I'm sure you'll learn about in terms of the Wallama list and the evaluation of the Wallama list, the pilot. And, those different ways of how we think about what justice looks like. And people use the language around, decolonising justice and decolonising systems and thinking about different ways of working. And, Koori Courts are a great example of where that started and how we can start to try and, reimagine different ways that these systems operate alongside, our communities and different things like that as well. Do you see like a bit of a future of any of that sort of stuff when you think about sort of the justice system more broadly and young people or our communities?
Yeah, I think there's definitely a path forward there, and there's different examples of reimagining these sorts of things. I still think that one of the big leaps of faith that has to still be taken is sharing the power with Aboriginal people who are external to the system, and that's probably true for most of the things I've been involved in. The sort of steps being taken there, but it takes it's a big courageous step to start to share decision making more. Yeah. And when you see that, whether it's in the courtroom or whether it's in DCJ, the more that happens, the better the outcomes are. It's just the system's built to defend itself from that. So it's got to be purposeful.
Yeah, absolutely. Hope you're enjoying the next episode of the Impact Policy Podcast. Impact Policy is a social policy consulting firm. We work closely with the public sector around navigating some of the most complex social policy challenges we're experiencing today. Our team specialise in co-design, engagement, research and evaluation, and communications. If you want to speak to the team about how we might be able to partner, collaborate together, and do some great work, you can reach out directly to myself, sam.johnson@impactpolicyau.com. You can check out our website for more detail, impactpolicyau.com. And you can follow us on LinkedIn and stay up to date and subscribe to our free newsletter and everything else that's happening across Impact Policy HQ. All right, now let's get back to the episode. Do you have any sort of ideas around what some of the sort of major building pieces of that puzzle or building blocks are in terms of how we sort of work towards shifting that power or sharing that decision making?
I think leadership hold responsibility, which is mainly non-Indigenous people, of course. As we know, to share decisions with community, you got to build those relationships first.
Absolutely.
And that's something that traditionally, public sector doesn't value or prioritize. And then on top of that, there's got to be there's got to be leadership who are willing to try to do things in a different way.
Yeah.
And not just on paper, but to actually commit to maybe making a mistake as well. But there's a lot of fear as well. And I think that's pretty understandable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an important point around that fear of making a mistake as well. I think that, traditionally the public sector is hyper risk averse, right? And hyper considering reputational sort of risk and all this other stuff that they're constantly trying to circumvent and navigate. But I think you're right, that real courageous leadership and the ability to try and put yourself into a space that you might not feel like you know all the answers to, but to try and share some of that load as part of navigating a way forward, and not feeling like you know what the end product might look like, I think is a mindset shift that we have to try and work towards for senior leaders listening.
Yeah.
We've seen glimmers of leaders do that and do that well and try and champion that, and we can see impact in those spaces to some degree too. You talked about you gave that example earlier of there was a period in that Sydney City office where there wasn't one kid in custody, one Aboriginal young person in custody, and attributed that to cultural programs work and the work of the Koori Court. Can you talk a little bit to, I guess, your background in that sort of cultural space, what you see as the significance of that for our people? And I guess any general reflections?
Yeah, it's a funny one, because when you're in the public sector and you've got some cultural background, you get held as a cultural expert, which culturally, or in our community, I would never allow that, and it's something that's always made me uncomfortable. But I've had access to people who, know a lot more than me. They've probably forgotten more than I know. But, due to colonisation, for our young people in the youth justice system, it's pretty rare to have any real connection to culture. And that's probably not just in the youth justice system, just how we all were raised, in our families, it wasn't...
100%.
Culture was something abstract, or footy and community stuff, but not really cultural teaching. So
absolutely,
I got access to fellas young, and I'm not really in my family, but maybe related to some. But I just know from those formative years, your late teens and your 20s, culture can build your identity for you, even if it's something that you don't even know at the time.
Yeah.
So, if you listen to people who talk about, practice and intervention for young people around offending, they talk about identity a lot. Culture is like a cheat code for black kids.
Yeah.
It gives you an identity that has principles and ethics and practice, and it inherently belongs to us. And these young fellas and young women, they don't always want to sit there with a white social worker or a white psych, but there's space for that. But the things that they will gravitate towards are the things that are theirs, that are ours.
Absolutely.
Which is culture.
Absolutely. How do you see, because again, you gave that example of when that was operating alongside the Koori Court, the impact of that sort of stuff. How do you say, and we see more, more, I guess, value given, the public sector is acknowledging more about, we should be trying to invest in cultural programs and, although it can be a whole lot better and done a whole lot more appropriately. Do you see a sort of space where this sort of stuff can be invested in, supported in more, resourced more, so we can see more of an impact, particularly for our kids in custody?
Yeah, definitely. And I think access to cultural programs, when we think of youth justice, we're talking about kids who've already spent time in custody. Mm. I think the younger that young people can access culture, obviously that's going to be the best outcome. Mm. We've got cultural practitioners who are working in and around the centres as well. But a lot of conversations I've had with young fellas in custody is that I do culture locked up and I go home and I can't access it now. Yeah. I know within myself from working in the sector that it is the most powerful tool to divert offending. Yeah. There's also like welfare issues, disability, mental health. There's those really practical things, but culture is what gives motivation.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of the times I was confronted with it the most was I used to run a mentoring program in Parkleigh Prison, and I'd go out there once a week and I'd be out there in Area 4 in the yard working with a lot of lads and, naturally just start building a lot of relationships for the brothers there. And, they'd be doing all this cultural stuff in jail and, whether it was dance, whether it was painting, whether it was language, whether it was like, group stuff together. I was a bit stunned, like walking in there going like, bro, they're doing more stuff in here than I've ever seen in my community. Like, this is wild. And then there would be a few lads that would get out and I'd go out to Blacktown and I'd see them at home and I'd be like, like we used to paint together when we go out and do the stuff once a week in the cells. And there was no space or place in community for our people to be able to come together, to have a space where culture can be practiced, can be shared, can be celebrated, that wasn't independent of like a system. And I found that was a massive like, I don't know, I just felt like it just really connected a lot of dots for me that I'd experienced as a young person. I was like, that's right, there is no space for this, for us to be able to come together to have this sort of stuff. I'd think about then I started thinking about, I got, my kids are, their mother's Pacific Islander. And so I started thinking about the same thing. We know that there's a heavy overrepresentation of Pacifica kids in custody and in the adult system. And I started to realize as well, like the same sort of principles apply in the sense that there's no sort of spaces or places for kids to come, in that sense, for kids to come together and practice culture that's separate from maybe the church or the institution. Yeah. So then you see these institutions and systems that almost become the holding ground for access to culture. I don't know, bro. It was really confronting.
I think the Pacifica point's a good point too, because it takes it away from just being an Aboriginal problem with the system, or not a problem, but a limitation. Like, responsive practice with young people is responsive. So what's responsive for a Pacific Islander kid and what's responsive for an Aboriginal kid might not be the same thing, but the principles are the same. Yeah. And we've got a white system that's full of black kids.
Yes.
So it's not built for them. There's change that's been happening by people who've been there a lot longer than me advocating in the space, and shout out to some of those old fellas because they've been really fighting, and the old aunts who've been in the public sector for a long time and pushing for this, and we're just starting to see it.
Absolutely.
But that's right, the principles are the same. And part of the reason I think that you can find more culture in custody is because that's where the money is.
Yes.
Like kids in custody, what is it, like close to $1 million a year?
Yep. A
kid in the community, you try and do cultural work, a lot of the time it's with scraps.
Yes.
It's back to front.
Absolutely. And that's funny, isn't it? It's like we talk about kids in the system and we talk about the value of, investing in these sorts of programs from that perspective. And we're happy to talk about it in that context. But if you remove a deficits dialogue around crime and justice and young people, and you just say like, hey, you know, public sector, whatever agency, invest in this, you know, cultural program, or it might be an Aboriginal dance company, or, you know, for young kids or whatever. There's no investment or connection or correlation to the significant evidence that we know is that if you engage kids early in that sort of stuff and create that space and access to culture and identity, that you significantly reduce the risks of, you know, coming into contact with the system later in life. Yeah. And I think that's come back again to talking about my own kids, but, you know, that they're lucky that they can access a cultural program in their community where they get to learn dance, they get to learn language and all that sort of stuff as well, which is beautiful. And it's been such a big part of their identity and their development. But we pay for that program, and we're paying families to access that program. And that's an Aboriginal business, and all power to them, because we need more Aboriginal businesses doing this sort of work as well. But what we also need is investment into those services so that they can be accessible for all kids and families to be able to, you know, get the same opportunities as all of us too.
Yeah, and like on that point, like we'd go in the Nuri Gamarata program, Uncle Dean's one, like we'd every second Thursday we'd go out on country, you know. That'd be the big day, like with a bit of a group. You have to go to every house, you got to knock on every door, you got to ring Nan. Yeah. Like these are young people often that like probably historically haven't been supported to engage in programs like that. You know what I mean? So like it has to be purposeful. Yeah. Because they're going to slip through the cracks again and again. And culture, every young person has a right to access it. And what they do with that's up to them, but they should have a right regardless of the support that they might or might not have at home. And you use a really powerful word there that I think a lot of people miss, which is around access. And you talk about, you know, Uncle Dean and yourself and whoever else, you know, having to call up and run around and do that work to you know, get fellas there for those programs. And I think a lot of times the public sector or, you know, projects design a program and then they just design it, announce it, and then they sit on their hands and wonder why, you know, there might be a lower participation rate or access, you know, might not be as successful as what they want. I think what you talk to a lot is about a lot of that stuff that is not always easily documented or communicated. It's like the soft skills, or it's the soft work that goes into that sort of stuff to really, you know, recognize that the young people that you're working with, exactly like you said, they might not have ever accessed programs like this. You know, their families might not, you know, this might be a new journey for them to be going on as well. And so there's a significant amount of work that goes into facilitating that access. And some people might be of the school of thought, Aboriginal or non-Aboriginal or whoever. Like I've heard many people say in my time, like, if they want to come, they'll just come. Like, if they want this, they'll come to it. And it's like, nah, it's not always that sort of simple. You know, you see that rhetoric thrown around all the time when people are talking about like youth employment and opportunities and different stuff like that. Like we're talking about, you talked about earlier with particularly kids in custody, you know, there might be, you know, trauma, there might be complex needs, there might be, you know, mental health stuff going on. There might be a range of issues that are happening for a young person outside of just access to culture. And so if you're not, you know, embedding those processes around really supporting access, then you are going to have low participation, and you are going to sit back and go, oh, no one must be interested, you know. But the success of what you fellas have done has obviously reiterated the importance of the opposite, you know. And a big one is shame too.
Yeah.
How many kids in the justice system are in the out-of-home care system? What's the first thing, like we did at the start of this, tell us where you're from, who your family are, etc. You got all these black kids who they can't answer these questions in a way that makes them feel comfortable to talk about it. So they just avoid it. Yeah. But then you say, okay, we're going to do this thing once a month, rock up here with your identity's shot to pieces, you're struggling internally, you're 15 or 16 or 17, it's a hard age anyway to engage, you know, with peers, and you're walking into a space that's cultural. That's a hard thing to do, and we overlook this shame all the time and make out like it's a kid's choice. He's choosing not to engage.
Yeah,
you got to figure out a way that works for that kid, and that might be one-on-one for a long time until they're comfortable. You know, build up their identity. I see so many times that a young person doesn't attend and they get reprimanded or they pay consequence for it, you know, which is not being able to access their own culture.
Yeah.
Then on the flip side of that, you know, another pitfall is we do a big NAIDOC Day event, or someone does a NAIDOC Day event, or do a one-off day, you know, and those things are great, like they are. But if you want to give someone the opportunity to reshape their own identity, that takes consistency.
Yes.
And consistency is what is really hard. It's easy to do one day. Doing it consistently takes commitment and it takes support. You know, it can't just be up to Aboriginal people to do that. Like, it needs support, it needs funding, like you said, and it needs, in the public sector, it needs to be prioritised, which I got at Sydney office, but like in the which I was really fortunate for. But in the public sector, generally speaking, if we're time poor, if we're resource poor, it's cultural stuff that gets cut first because it's not seen as core work.
Yeah, it's not primary, is it? Yeah, absolutely. That's why I keep thinking of, as much as we need the sector to step up and understand that this needs to be a consistent long-term investment, you know, in terms of this sort of work. We continually sort of see, like, you were in the public sector long enough to see the impact of machinery of government, you know, and how stuff just gets chopped and changed, and, you know, funding gets stripped, directions and priorities, you know, change, and all that sort of stuff as well. And I see that so often with, you know, we think about a lot of times people will talk about governance in our communities. You know, we're Aboriginal community controlled orgs. You know, they need stronger governance systems and models and all this sort of stuff. And it's like, but there's only ever funding cycles that exist within such a small space of time for any significant impact to be invested in. And it's similar to like this cultural work you're talking about. And I don't know, I feel like there's a real opportunity, particularly for like maybe some of them other sectors like philanthropy and other spaces as well, that they're not tied to these sort of system cycles, you know, and maybe they can invest in stuff that is a bit more longer term and can give us some stability outside of, doesn't remove the sector from their responsibility in terms of partnering, supporting and being a part of that process, but maybe just gives us some of that maybe longer term consistency in this sort of space too. There's been some good examples of that, but I just think about like stuff like governance, stuff like investing in that longer term community sort of work. I just think, I don't know, mate, I think, bro, I'm just getting tired of seeing great stuff in community just get lifted and pulled away, stuff like that. But
I know I'm like, Dinawan's connections back home, like, you know, they were really great for me as a young man, like probably the people I'm referring to in terms of like a cultural journey, and then there's some others as well, but they always did everything for free, teach and dance to kids at the park in Cowra. Uncle Dean in Sydney, he did Nyurugamarata, that was never funded. Yeah. He did that as part of his role, but just because if he needed it funded, it would have fallen over. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, that's not right.
Yeah,
but
absolutely.
It's taken Aboriginal people willing to do stuff for free to like start to show, okay, well, this needs to be funded because we can see that it works.
Yeah. And that comes back to real community led responses, right? Like it's that regardless of whether government's coming along or not, we're showing up and we're doing this because we believe in it. And I think, like, you know, you've seen, like, you know, that Clean Slate project in Redfern, you know, with Uncle Shane, and that it emerged off the back of the Redfern riots, you know, community imploding, youth crime through the roof. And it's been around for so long now. And, you know, some days they've had 300 people there and some days they've had 8, you know. But I remember yarning with Uncle Shane, and I'm sure they've had funding at different times to support that sort of stuff. But there's been a stack load of times when they haven't. And I remember specifically, he said to me one time, he goes, like, no matter what happens, whether anyone's funding this or not, we're coming here Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 6:30, and that's it. Like, and it just reinforced exactly what you talk about with Dinner One Connection, exactly what you talk about with Uncle Dean. It's like, that's that consistency, right? Like over a period of time of our people continuing to show up, where we can see the biggest impact, but doesn't excuse the sector or other people from being a part of that journey together and supporting that too.
I think it's such a great example of Aboriginal people and community. Like, where else do you find people, you know, in their professional life, their businesses, show up for free and do stuff? Like, never.
Yeah.
It just shows where the intent is, and I think if that's where the intent is, that's where the change is, and there's such a strong argument to keep building funding in that space.
So we talked a lot about at a community level, talked about some of the learnings from a sort of practice example in terms of what programs look like in community. We've talked about the Koori Court, concepts around decolonising justice. We've also talked about how, you know, cultural programs, you know, exist alongside, or, you know, the system can invest in and support them to have more impact. As you transition through your journey in the youth justice space, you found yourself sitting more in a strategic policy sort of space. How was that journey from coming in, you know, on a 3-month contract as a caseworker to sitting up? Because I know when I first met you, you were sitting up in there with, you know, some of the highest people in the public sector in, you know, Department of Communities and Justice before you came here. So somewhat of a journey.
Yeah, it's pretty odd. It wasn't something that I planned. I remember I actually had people tell me, "Oh, you'll end up in a strategic space one day," and I said never. I just say never, ever, ever. I want to work with young people.
Yeah,
that's all I want to do, and I'll just then leave me there.
Yeah,
and then it sort of happened. You know, like there was an opportunity to go to the Aboriginal Strategic Coordination Unit. Carol Thomas had just sort of taken over. I really wanted to work with her, and there were some people there that I respected a lot and thought I could learn off, and I did. And I've really enjoyed being in that strategic space. I think it's something that I probably have more, that there's an opportunity to develop more, but it's something that I've taken to pretty well, and I'm interested in it. And part of like coming to impact is that big picture thinking and thinking about how can we optimise outcomes for community with the resources that we have, on a small and large scale. And it's something that I've really enjoyed.
Yeah, absolutely. What do you think about the future for the sector, whether that's within youth justice or the public sector more broadly? You've talked about power and sort of sharing decision making and stuff like that, and, you know, obviously that's a massive one, and the sector's been talking about it for a long time. What do you think are some of the other sort of strengths or challenges we need to sort of look at moving forward?
I mean, there's a lot of challenges. I think, I think as the public sector moves towards co-design and being responsive to community needs, there's going to be this ebb and flow of power sharing. I think talking about it's one thing. It's actually really hard to do. I think this first starting point is you see leaders in the public sector who have more success in this space. It's because they actually value it to their core. It's not a direction. It's not a strategic direction. They have relationships in the community and they value them. The same principles apply to cultural practice. You'll do it inconsistently and deprioritise it if you don't value it correctly. Yeah. Working with community and sharing that decision making and sharing power will only happen if people truly believe that the answers are not internal. And that's a really big leap, because we know that the public sector, it's actually been built to withhold power from community.
Absolutely. Hope you're enjoying the episode of the Impact Policy podcast. Impact Policy is a social policy consulting firm. We work really closely with the public sector around navigating some of the most complex social policy challenges we're experiencing today. We specialise in co-design, engagement, research and evaluation, and communications. If you, your team, or someone you know needs to reach out to us to have a conversation in more detail about how we might be able to support you navigate your own social policy journey, you can follow us along on LinkedIn, you can subscribe to the podcast here, and you can reach out to us directly at www.impactpolicyau.com. Enjoy the episode. We know, I mean, we're talking about sharing power and decision making, you know, at a pretty sort of significant level, you know, when we think about, you know, government agencies and different, you know, directorates within that. And, you know, we know that our communities are so diverse from community to community. We know that, you know, governance can look different. Decision making can look different from community to community as well. What do you think are some of the complexities or challenges that we probably need to navigate from our perspective when we talk about sharing power and sharing decision making, and how we navigate a way forward with that?
Yeah, I think like going back to that fear thing as well from before, like a lot of people in government haven't been asked to work this way. They weren't hired to work this way. These skills of engaging with community are not something they've ever been asked to develop before now. I think working with Aboriginal people in the space, like at Impact or other spaces, part of the role is to make people feel competent to do so and safe to do so, you know, because most people don't have a personal relationship with Aboriginal people outside of work, you know, and that sounds crazy, but that's the reality of it. We're 3% of the population. I think there needs to be confidence built into people to say, like, you can go to this community that might be foreign to you. These are the principles that you have to go there with, you know, transparency, flexibility, authenticity. And this is what you have to prioritise, not extracting information or doing a hit and run job where you're trying to get an outcome for yourself. Yeah. Take the time to sit there. Uncle Billy Bell, I haven't asked him for permission to say this, but mad fella, I worked with him. He's worked in the sector for decades and he was in it, you know, he was a survivor on it. And he always used to say, I've learnt in government to be a white fella. Like, when are you going to come and sit and learn to be a black fella with me? I think it's such a good thing. Like, when are we going to value it enough to take the time?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's really the big step. And the further we get away from like the frontline space, the harder it is. And I found that too. Like, the higher I went in like the strategic or the central office space, the harder it was for me to sit down with people and listen, because you're getting dragged away from it. The output of work in those spaces is enormous, but the outcomes don't represent that, or not for our people. Yeah. So it's actually slowing down, and a lot of those cultural principles come into it. Slow down. Like, let's think about what we want to prioritise and how we want to prioritise our time.
Absolutely.
Because the timelines that we oppose in ourselves in the public sector are self-imposed 95% of the time.
Yes, absolutely. Critical points, particularly around that stuff around, we self-impose so much pressure in terms of how we create this operational sort of space that is so in contrast to what we know really works well in terms of building strong relationships that lead to great outcomes. And then from the other side, thinking about like speaking to our people and our communities as well. Like, if, you know, people are listening to this that might be, you know, maybe they're working for an ACO, maybe they're working for a peak body, maybe they're a senior leader in their community and they're, you know, active in this sort of space. If we're talking about sort of shared decision making, sharing power, and, you know, working towards this sort of ideal space where we do have these mechanisms that exist where our people have a voice in terms of informing critical decisions that shape, you know, maybe youth justice or wherever within the sector. What do you think are some of the maybe complexities that we need to navigate at a cultural level in our communities?
It's funny because, like, again, like, the responsibility for some of this falls back on community when community's been willing the whole time, which isn't fair, but like, it is what it is. I think the more space we create for people to be in the share space between government and like these ACOs and things like that, it's a good thing. Yeah. Inviting your local leaders in government to things and to sit in space, and look, that doesn't mean they're going to do it or even that they're the right person to be, but sometimes it will have a good outcome. And like, Aboriginal people have persevered to work with government for decades when really there's probably, I think that there'd be enough, it would be understandable if people didn't want to. Yeah. So I think it's about creating space, and again, it's not really, shouldn't be community's responsibility, but, you know, making people from government feel safe to sit in it. Because at the end of the day, that's where the resources are, and we need them. We need government at the table.
Yeah, definitely. And some of that yarn reminds me of the recent thought leadership piece that you worked on for impact policy. And people that are watching or listening to this now will be able to access that through our LinkedIn channels and through our newsletter there as well. But you want to talk to a little bit of some of that sort of stuff, because I feel like some of that, I mean, I know you used a quote there that was sort of inspired some of the thinking in that sort of work. But yeah, any key stuff from that thought leadership piece that builds on any of this or that you want to highlight?
Yeah, I think like it's sort of got to do with valuing, you know, a part of it is around valuing Aboriginal voice. And I think like a pitfall we fall into, like being like an Aboriginal man, maybe I presented in a way and can speak in a way that was palatable to white government people, and being a man as well helps in most sectors. I like benefited from certain things, you know, like what I would say would be valued more. Then you got young fellas, families, community leaders, people who are far more educated than me, but maybe don't present in a way that's palatable to white government institutions, or haven't worked in the sector so they know how to, or maybe they don't want to. Their voice gets devalued.
Yeah, absolutely.
We minimise Aboriginal voice. When I say we, like the public sector has an opportunity then to minimise voice because they don't hold stature through a white lens. Really the most important voices are those ones.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time in the last 18 months in the public sector trying to make that shift.
Yep.
And a lot of Aboriginal people have before me too. So I think it's really, we have to look through expertise in a different way. Is that because you have a tertiary education in something doesn't make you an expert in Aboriginal ways of knowing and being.
Yeah.
And that there's lots of people out there who are willing to talk. But if you're going to take the time and ask people to talk, you have to value what they say.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that a lot of that really resonates with me. I remember being a kid, but I mean, I was a teenager, and I didn't realise till, you know, I was probably in the public sector that it was a community consultation, and it was at my primary school, but I was there like as a teenager, and I can't remember, maybe it was off the back of like an NAIDOC event or something, but I was at Glebe Public School, and I remember this person talking about some stuff that was happening. Maybe they were building something. I can't remember the context, but I remember like a lot of the men from my community that were like some of the most sort of, you know, confident, vocal sort of people, just silent, like up, not saying nothing, up in the back, just not like people were just listening. And then I remember years later when I was in the public sector, I reflected on that experience as a kid, remembering like that was a consultation. And then it made me think about how much we create spaces that either amplify voices or silent voices, and how sometimes the loudest voices in a space aren't always representative of a community, of a viewpoint, and different things like that. And I think we tend to see a bit of a trend of that sometimes in terms of how we design engagement, consultation, decision making, and all this sort of stuff in a way that sometimes only amplifies certain types of voices.
I think I was talking to my cousin about this sort of stuff a couple of weeks ago. You know, someone made the comment, you know, it's human nature that the loudest voices get elevated, but I don't think it is human nature, because we live since time started, and that wasn't how our community worked.
Yeah.
If you look at our symbolism and figures of people of respect, you know, that are thousands of years old, that it's not about, you know, in our culture, like to be powerful and wise and smart and strong is to not talk, you know, silence. But in the modern context, you get elevated for it by white institutions.
Absolutely.
And you get elevated by white institutions, depending on how palatable you are. And, you know, like that's something like once you understand how things work, like I benefited from that. Like I know that, you know.
Absolutely.
And also probably because the way I look too, you know. We get fellas who present like in a certain way that it puts white fellas off straight away.
You talk about, you know, palatable voices and, you know, representatives and, you know, people that can step into these spaces and have validity and stuff. And, you know, we think about some of the challenges in the youth justice space, you know, where immediately if somebody has their criminal history, or they might have had a criminal history in the past or whatever, then, you know, their immediate ability to be a role model or, you know, do cultural work or any of that sort of stuff might be affected. But yeah, how do we start to navigate that sort of stuff? Like, that's a great example in Alice in terms of giving community more authority over permission to step into those spaces.
There's got to be like some trust there.
Yeah.
'Cause the public sector sees sharing power as a risk, and maybe like personally there's a risk there for white leaders or non-Indigenous leaders to share power. But the biggest risk for Aboriginal young people is doing the same thing. It's not a risk for us. Yeah. It's not a risk in terms of outcomes, because we've seen a lot of resources and we've seen little change in outcomes. Actually, in fact, at the moment, it's going backwards in this space. So I just think that we have to shift our lens. The same is the risk. There is no risk of sharing power because what we're doing now is not working.
Yeah.
And we've got really good examples of where sharing power works, but they're on the smaller scale. It's about bringing those principles up to a level that can be overreaching, far-reaching. Yeah. And that's more challenging because, like I said, there's the distance between, you know, the hierarchical structure builds distance between community and leaders.
Absolutely. You talk about some of those complexities and stuff when we think about this from a systems perspective. You also grew up, I see you wearing the Arambi All Blacks 100 years knockout jumper or jersey maybe.
Yeah.
And so, you know, you said you're from Kiara, so connection to regional New South Wales. How does that perspective come in from a regional versus sort of urban perspective as well when we think about this stuff? Because a lot of the times we see I know we're hammering the public sector a lot this podcast, but you know, we often see decisions made in urban settings, you know, when a lot of the issues that we're talking about, you know, are really heavily condensed across regional towns and communities too.
Yeah, it's a good point, you know, because the decisions are made in Sydney, you know, and I've lived half my life in both, but, you know, when your recent article, you know, about, you know, the place-based initiatives, if we look at the places where we've got higher rates of youth offending, you know, they talk about trends like, you know, car theft and break and enters, and maybe there's trends in offending, but the locations regionally where there's high rates of offending are pretty much always the locations where black people were taken and forced to live. And there's that, you know, intergenerational poverty and trauma and things like that. So to make decisions on each of these locations with really different history, different challenges, but also like to take it out of the deficit, there's different opportunities.
Yes, absolutely.
But how can you make decisions on resourcing from 500 k's away if you don't know the community there?
Yeah.
These are really easy things to say and they're hard things to change. I'll acknowledge that. But as long as like that's acknowledged that the best decision makers are the people there, it sounds simple, but it's sort of not.
Yeah, yeah. What do you think becomes some of the complexities on the ground with trying to shift towards more place-based stuff in regional communities?
I think, you know, there's lots of complexities within communities, and when funding's involved, that all comes out, and that's you know, that's a part of it. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't pursue it.
Yeah, definitely.
I think when we're talking about funding, you know, like there's bits of money that probably aren't massive to the public sector, but to community they are. And youth justice have moved towards this in the last 18 months, is like having people making decisions about that funding who are from there.
Yeah.
I'm not saying there's not, like, I'm sure there's ways to improve that, but that's a big step.
Yeah, massively.
And it means that government aren't making decisions on behalf of community. Well, it's one example of handing the decision making over that's really tangible.
Yeah.
It's good. It's a great thing.
I think that's a great example. You know, when you think about procurement, you think about tendering, you think about allocating funding and grants. Yes, you're exactly right. It's a really tangible, practical decision that a public sector could make or organisation could make that can really have a significant impact in terms of sharing power.
Yeah.
I think we've seen that. We've seen that in the youth justice space, personally at Impact Policy. We've also seen in different parts of the public sector and also, philanthropy where that hasn't happened. And we've seen the friction and impact of that as well. And, we do a lot of work around providing advice around particularly Aboriginal procurement and policy. And a lot of that comes back to those principles around sharing power and local impact as well. And I think for anyone listening that is working in the sector, that is such a critical piece of advice to take away whenever you're making a decision about funding, about procurement, around any of that sort of stuff. If that's going to have a direct and local impact, then you need to have some sort of a representative that has, at best, a connection to that community and from that community informing the decision that comes out of it, or at the very least an Aboriginal representative as part of that panel that's sharing that decision and informing the outcome as well. I think that's really valuable.
I'd go one step further too. I'd have a community-dominated panel.
Yeah, definitely.
So you probably have a representative from YJ, but recently we've seen the agency move to actually having 2 community people and 1 YJ person.
Yeah.
Why not? And
absolutely.
It's been great. There's been better outcomes because of it, and it's really an achievable thing.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's even more so. I think that's strong because it reduces the risk as well for, because there's a people talk about that 2 worlds challenge for us mob working in the space and living in these worlds, but we also talk about the we know at a local level there sometimes can be friction around where funding goes, because we know we're often fighting to keep as community orgs and not-for-profits, we're fighting to keep our head above water most of the time. And so, everyone knows who's got funding and why. And so, I think that's a great example of, if anything, have multiple members of the community informing those decisions. And I think that goes more to also providing a level of cultural strength or cultural safety around those processes too, so that if it's not just one person sitting on that panel, that they're leaving themselves at risk of, decision, like scrutiny of decision and scrutiny of outcomes, falling back on them. But if there's a combination of people that are connected to that community, then it is really shared in terms of the decision and outcome at the end of it. Mm-hmm. Stumbled through that, but hopefully that makes sense for people listening. So we've gone through quite a lot here that I'm sure is really valuable for people across the sector. Anything else that you sort of want to touch on and pull out as part of today?
Yeah, I'll probably because it sounded like there's been things that sounded negative about the public sector, but the public sector's always had these traits and it's built like that. You know what I mean? And it's positive that people are talking about this and moving it into another direction. I think at the moment, for leaders in the public sector, or just the public sector as a whole, there's so much opportunity right now. You know what I mean? There's the climate's for it. There's a lot of evidence being built to support these things. It's sort of an accepted notion now, where I think before it was sort of taboo. Yeah. I think it's really exciting. And I just encourage people, if there's hesitation or there's unsurety about how to move forward in these ways, but it's something that you want to do, to reach out to someone, take advantage of it now, because, things change, environments change, and right now there's opportunity everywhere to improve outcomes, everywhere, if we can, work as a collective. Absolutely.
And just to touch on that point you said there around the evidence is there, and I think that's a really important point for us to touch on, before we sort of come to an end as well, is how we start to understand what evidence and outcomes look when we talk about impact in the community. And we've talked a lot, I know, in your time here at Impact, we've been talking a lot about understanding how we co-design what success looks like alongside our communities, and how we've seen, traditionally in the past, many projects come in and come out, and there be different perspectives around what's successful and what's not, depending on what maybe the public sector experiences versus the community. But do you have any thoughts or sort of reflections on how we can start to think about what the future looks like when we start to understand what impact sort of is? Because, like, for example, we started this yarn talking about the significance of cultural programs and that around identity and how powerful that is. And, you know, would you use outcomes around recidivism rates to measure the success of a program like that? Or will community have other metrics for how they would determine a project like that successful?
I think young people being able to identify, you know, what their cultural identity is, what it means to them, what their teachings are, that's success. You know, we often look at these interventions and programs and look for an immediate outcome, but we know that's not how it works.
Yeah.
And I know as a young fellow, it's not how it worked for me either. You know, you learn something at 17, you don't understand it sometimes for a while, but it's valuable nonetheless, just because it's not in the timeline that maybe we want.
Absolutely.
And I think you made a really strong point that we need to look at the community and what, you know, young people, whoever the stakeholders are, and ask them what success is.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really important first step.
Absolutely. I think that's a nice point for people to listen to try and take away, is that when you are thinking about what success looks like, to really make sure that you're not determining what success looks like, or your agency or your team, and that those decisions are made together around how you understand that. And that you share that power and you share that decision making, and you give our communities some agency to really inform what that looks like together. Look, I just want to say how exciting it is, brah, to have you here. And, you know, it's, for anyone that's listening to this, it's Kyan's first week. He's been thrown in the hot seat, and he's straight into everything impact policy. He's out in community next week working on some exciting stuff. He's, you know, developed, you know, you can probably access his thought leadership piece that's come out by the time that you can hear this as well, through our LinkedIn as well. And, you know, we do a stack of stuff across the sector, not just in youth justice. And I think a lot of the themes that you talk about, whilst you're drawing on your experience in, you know, from a youth justice perspective, this is stuff that translates across these systems. And so I'm sure that, and I'm certain that people can take away so much from this outside of just justice specific stuff, and start to think about how we take some of those concepts and apply them to how we understand ways of working at scale too.
Yeah, but I think the principles of working, one of the good things is they apply everywhere, because all the systems and, you know, the historical context is similar, which that's a good thing. You know, that means that we can develop skills and they can apply those skills everywhere.
Yeah.
But yeah, our first week got me on the podcast. I was ashamed too. Thanks, Brad. I'm really excited to be here, cuz.
You did well, brah. Well done. Thank you.